Hey ghouls and gals, welcome back to my channel. My name is Taylor and it is time for another brand new release horror reading vlog. One of my unofficial 2024 goals was to read more backlists, and I have been doing a really good job of that, incorporating more backlist titles throughout the year instead of just primarily focusing on new release books. However, this has been the summer of buzzy new horror releases, and I have my hands on 3 of those titles that I just see so many people talking about. They're everywhere on Bookstagram, they're everywhere on BookTube, and these 3 titles have been getting a lot of hype, so I figured let's do a new release reading vlog. Because even though I said one of my goals was to read more backlist this year, I do also make a video every single month of the new releases that I'm excited to check out, and I do like when I actually manage to get to those books. So I have 3 books, they're all brand new horror releases, and we're gonna read them for a new release horror vlog. I am going to be reading How to Make a Horror Movie and Survive by DiLouie. This is one of the many books that have come out this year that have to deal with cursed film or making a horror movie production, and that is something that works really well for me in a horror book, so I'm intrigued to pick this up. It's about a filmmaker and he gets like this haunted camera that impacts the production of the horror movie that he's making. So this is book number 1. The next book is actually the only one that wasn't on my TBR, but I solely added it because of all the hype that has been surrounding it, and that would be Chuck Tingle's Bury Your Gaze. I tried to read Camp Damascus last year and it just didn't really click with me, so I wasn't initially planning on picking this one up. However, because of the reviews, I feel like I might like this one a little bit more, and the title is just such a great pun on a horror trope. This one is also horror movie adjacent, I believe, or like horror TV show. We're following a character, lives in Hollywood. He has this big break on this big television show, and the network wants his character to die in the upcoming season finale, and this would be very tropey. It would be under the Bury Your Gaze trope. Our main character refuses, but realizes that has put a real-life target on his back as horror movie monsters start stalking him and his friends in Hollywood. And then last but not least is a very buzzy body horror, and that would be The Eyes Are the Best Part by Monica Kim. After some family trauma and her mother remarrying a white man, our main character is really going through it psychologically, and she starts having dreams about eyes, but not only eyes, consuming them, and she cannot stop fantasizing about consuming eyes. This is a psychological horror that has body horror elements that I have heard are really effective. So we have our 3 selections. We've got one that's very psychological horror, dark, disturbing, gory. We've got a more paranormal horror with a cursed object, and of course the Hollywood film, cursed film tropes. And then we also have, I think this one is a little bit satirical. It's going to be a horror, but it's also going to play on like horror comedy and horror tropes. So 3 very different books for this horror vlog, but I'm excited. I think we're going to read them in the order that I introduced them, just because we'll start with a paranormal horror, we'll move into horror comedy territory, and then we'll wrap it all up with what I anticipate, just my predictions, being the most effective horror for me, because body horror tends to be what I find like the most impactful and scary in terms of horror. So I am going to start reading How to Make a Horror Movie and Survive, and I will check back in with a reading update tomorrow. Okay, so I am now 22% of the way through How to Make a Horror Movie and Survive by DiLouie. What I can say at this point in the story is that I do not recommend the audiobook. I tried to listen to this via audiobook while I was reading it physically. I like to have both formats of a book going on at the same time if I can, because when I don't have time to read physically, I can still listen to the audiobook as I'm doing chores or doing other things. That is not going to work for this book. I cannot not stand the way that this audiobook is narrated. The narrator has a very interesting cadence choice. He sounds like an announcer for a sporting event. The way that he's like, it just sounds like he's broadcasting like news bulletins, and there's no inflection or emotion to like properly convey the story. It just feels like kind of like a text-to-talk situation where you can have something narrate something for you. And while that gets the job done, when I listen to an audiobook, I want to be told a story. I want to have the same feeling as if I'm sitting around a campfire and having someone tell a story to me, and that is just not working. The final straw was when I was listening to something that was supposed to be a very traumatic, gruesome event, and I did not get that. It felt like it was supposed to be hokey and almost comedic from the way that the audiobook narration read it. So I went back and read that scene physically, and it played out so differently. So we are not listening to the audiobook for the rest of this time. We are switching to just physically, and hopefully that kind of changes my expectations about this one, because this is not giving me the greatest first impression. I think a large part of that has to deal with my experience with the audiobook. However, at this point in, we're following a film director, Max Maury, and he should be at the top of the world. Critics are loving his new movie, which is the third in a slasher series. This also takes place in the 80s, by the way. I don't think I mentioned that because I don't even think that I realized this was not going to be taking place in like present day, but he's at the top of his game. However, he feels constrained by being told to make movies. His producers and the people who are funding his projects will only pay for more sequels, and he feels like that story is done. He wants to create something unique and horrific that'll really make audiences feel something. At the beginning of this book, he meets Sally Priest, who is an actress who's struggling to get her big break. She believes that she has what it takes to be a final girl in a horror movie, and the two of them decide to team up and make this really cool horror movie. They are inspired by this really cool retro camera that Max buys from an estate sale that has a very sinister history, and he starts to feel like maybe this camera not only has a tragic history coincidentally, but perhaps this camera is creating the tragedies itself. So 22% of the way in, I'm gonna be honest, do not have the greatest first impressions. However, I'm really hoping that once I get further into the story and dive deeper in, because again, at 20%, we're kind of just setting up what's on the back of like the book with the blurb and setting up, just introducing the characters and all of that. So I'm hoping my next update for this one is going to be a little bit more optimistic, fingers crossed, but I have a lot of time to read today. So I'm hoping to read a good portion of this today, hoping to maybe hit the 50% mark or so. So that is what I'm going to do today. I will check back in with an update tomorrow and let y'all know how this one's going for me. So I am now 50% of the way through this one, and I'm not having a great time, unfortunately. This one was one of the many books that came out this year that had a horror movie kind of premise, and this one just, I don't know if it's like my expectations. Like, I loved the book Horror Movie that came out earlier this year by Paul Tremblay. That's one of my favorite horrors of the year, but this one is just really not working for me. I was really hoping that it was down to me listening to the audiobook and not really loving that experience. However, the physical book, I do think it's still better than the audiobook, just because I was not a fan of the narration style, but I'm not loving this one. First of all, this one, the premise is very, very reminiscent of Say Cheese and Die, the Goosebumps book, and I honestly, that's one of my favorite Goosebumps book. It was the scariest, or one of the scariest Goosebumps to me as a kid while I was reading them, and then as an adult, it's one of these synopsises that I think about about the most, that I can recall the most clearly. So clearly it had an impact on me, and this one kind of feels like an adult version of that. However, there's none of like the campiness or silliness that Say Cheese and Die had, and honestly, at this point in time, with the premises being so similar, I would really recommend just picking up Say Cheese and Die, because I think the cursed camera and the kind of taking pictures in the Goosebumps book or video in this one, and then it turns into a cursed situation. I honestly think that the Goosebumps book did that a little bit better. And the other thing that I don't love about this one, well, first of all, I don't love our main character. I don't need to love a main character to love a horror book, but for this one, it's so dependent on the main character and how he's utilizing this camera. And it's really hard for me to buy into the fact that, I don't think this is a spoiler, very early on, you learn this camera, it's haunted. I think, you know, maybe we could have spent a little bit more time trying to figure out if the camera is truly haunted, but our main character knows that very early on, and so the stakes in which he puts himself in and puts the people around himself in, just like, I'm not like buying it. I'm finding it really hard to suspend my disbelief, and I'm not finding it hard to suspend my disbelief about the cursed object and the haunted camera and the paranormal aspects. I'm really good at suspending my disbelief. I feel like you have to be to read a lot of fantasy, a lot of horror that has to deal with paranormal elements. That's not the part I'm having a problem with. I'm having a hard time suspending my disbelief about just like character motivations and intentions and character decisions. So that's been hard for me. Also, again, I'm 50% of the way in. We have not started filming the horror movie yet. So the title for this one is pretty apt, because how to make a horror movie, 50% of the way in, we're still going through like the various steps in how to get a horror movie into production, into actually filming. And I do think that the pacing of this one and perhaps my enjoyment of this one would be a little bit better if like from chapter 1 we were already starting to film this movie, because I was looking forward to seeing like a movie production and these people filming a horror movie and things go awry like on the set. That's not what we're getting here. We haven't gotten to actually filming the movie yet. So I don't know, I'm not loving this one. It's not enough to DNF it, because I did feel kind of similarly. I just realized this is the same author that wrote episode 13, and that is another horror book where I really was not vibing with it in the beginning, and then I kept reading it, and by the end I enjoyed it for the most part. Maybe this book will really stick the landing. I don't know. Unfortunately, I hate that I'm coming on here with such a negative update. I was really anticipating loving this one, so hopefully the second half goes a lot better for me, but right now, not really feeling it. So fingers crossed in the next talking update in this vlog that I managed to enjoy the latter 50% of this one a whole lot more. Okay, so I finished How to Make a Horror Movie and Survive. I did not like this one. I think that this concept is really cool. It's really fascinating, and I was really excited about this one. Unfortunately, it just didn't meet like any of my expectations. I think if you are looking for a book that really goes through like making a horror movie, I would recommend Horror Movie by Paul Tremblay. I also would recommend Burn the Negative by Josh Winning. I also think Silver Nitrate by Sylvia Moreno Garcia like does that a little bit better than this book did. I think all of those are like good recommendations for me. I really enjoyed them, but if someone is wanting a book about like the filmmaking process and then like a cursed film set or just a horror book about making a horror movie and like horror cinema, I think those did it better. Unfortunately, this just really missed the mark, and I think there was a period of time from about, I would say, the 70 to 85% mark of this that was good. My favorite parts of this were when we were actually watching like the camera rolling and the movie being filmed. That was the coolest part, especially because this was about a haunted camera. I know that I was a little harsh mentioning before that this feels like an adult version of Say Cheese and Die and just doesn't do the concept as well as Say Cheese and Die. I mean, I'm gonna be honest, I still think if you want that kind of concept, I think Say Cheese and Die is a really good horror classic. Can we call it a horror classic? Because didn't it come out in like the 90s or early 2000s? So I just think that book did this concept better. Now I think if this would have leaned fully into like the cheese and the camp, I think they could have gone a little bit better, because our main character Max is such an edgelord. He is so serious about horror, and I don't need to love the main protagonist to enjoy a horror book. However, he just felt very one-dimensional, and he is just like an amalgamation of a lot of horror fans that I just really don't love, like the gatekeepy horror-y fans. Usually they're also kind of very nitpicky about women in horror and constantly being like, oh, do you actually even like horror? So you know, he was very one-dimensional. I did like Sally a little bit better. I do wish that we would have followed her more, because I think her path and her journey is more interesting, but we didn't. We followed Max, and just I felt like all of the characters in here were very one-dimensional, and that could have worked almost if this again leaned into the camp, leaned into the cheese factor, because on its head, like the concept that this is a haunted camera and that the camera makes people die, that's a very cheesy concept. It's a very fun concept. If I'm watching this, and actually I do think there was a horror movie that came out with a similar premise. I don't remember what it's called. I want to say it came out in the early 2000s, like the 2010s actually, I think, where that one was also compared to Say Cheese and Die, because it was about a group of teenagers and they had a camera and you take photos, and the camera like captures people like dying or whatever. That one was very cheesy. It wasn't a Hereditary or Midsommar. Like, it was a cheesy B horror movie, but it was a lot of fun. This one just felt like it took itself so seriously. This one takes itself so seriously, which is strange because a lot of the deaths in here, they read almost very like comedic. They're over the top, they're very gruesome, but they also kind of read like a little bit cheesy, which was definitely at odds with like the rest of the messaging. And then again, this book just felt very, very wordy. A lot of times we have characters monologuing about the horror genre, about how great the horror genre is. If you're picking up this book, I feel like you already know that horror is like a legitimate genre and it doesn't need defended, because the monologues felt more like the author talking about horror as a genre, as opposed to the characters just naturally talking about them in their dialogue. So unfortunately, I did not love this one. It is always a bummer when one of my most anticipated of the year turns out to be a book that I just don't love. So we are moving on to the next book in this vlog. I know I said in the introduction I was going to read that one, then Bury Your Gaze, then The Eyes Are the Best Part. However, Bury Your Gaze has a not similar premise, but it does have a premise of being set in Hollywood, and it's following like the film industry a little bit. So I have such a bad taste in my mouth from this book that I'm just gonna switch up the order in which I'm reading the books, and I'm going to pick up The Eyes Are the Best Part by Monica Kim. This is a very different premise than the other two, and I have heard so many people loving this one. I know that I shouldn't get my hopes up, shouldn't buy into the hype, because that has been stinging me a lot this year. A lot of buzzy 2024 releases have just not been working for me, but then again, some of them definitely have been. So I am intrigued. The people that I've heard talk about this one and have loved it have been people who have generally very similar taste to me, so I'm hoping this one is going to work a little bit better. The blurb for this one says this is a feminist psychological horror about the making of a serial killer from a Korean American perspective. So let's dive into this one. Fingers crossed that I vibe with this one a little bit better. Hey vlog, so the last time that we talked, I was on the very verge of a reading slump. I had just finished How to Make a Horror Movie and Survive, did not like it at all. I've gone at length in this vlog about how much I did not like it, and I was going to start the next book in this vlog. I was going to give another update. It was a very strange couple of reading days for me because after the DiLouie book, I was not like, I was in a reading slump kind of. I wasn't completely there. I was like 90% of the way in a reading slump, and I knew I had to be very strategic about books and reading to avoid being in one for a large period of time. So I kind of took a little bit of a break for reading. I started a reread of one of Stephen King's Dark Tower books and just really ignored the fact that I was in the middle of a vlog, started reading purely for enjoyment, trying to pull myself out of that reading slump. And then when I felt a little bit better, a little bit more optimistic about reading, I started this one, and pun very much intended, I devoured it. I don't know if you can tell by my bookmark, but I'm like 95% of the way through this one. I absolutely flew through it. So much so that I was really tempted to finish this all in one sitting, but I did want to come on and give an update for this book because I am really enjoying it. I gave a couple updates about the DiLouie, and I just felt like I was really negative, but it's hard to do when you're not loving a book and you had highly anticipated it. But this book is great. First of all, it's very fast-paced, it's very readable. The chapters are very short, some of them are only like a page or two, so this one definitely, I mean, maybe I'm a little bit biased, but I feel like this is the perfect time for me to have picked this one up. It feels like a really good book to pull you out of a reading slump. It's very fast-paced, but it's also character-driven, so I think this appeals to people who like a character study or a character-forward book, but also people who want more of a fast-paced read. This is definitely good for her horror. This is also kind of what I wanted A Certain Hunger by Chelsea G. Summers to be. This is just really great. So let's talk about the synopsis quickly. We are following our main character, Ji-won, and she is kind of at a crossroads in her life. It's not a great time for her personally. She has just made the transition from high school to college and is finding college a whole lot harder than she thought it was. In addition to that, her father has just suddenly up and left her mother, and that's caused a lot of turmoil and trauma. Her mother is distraught, as well as Ji-won and her sister. Amidst all this turmoil, way too soon in the opinion of Ji-won, her mother meets a man, they start dating, and things start moving very, very quickly. This man's name is George. He is white, which is important because Ji-won and her mother and her sister are all Korean. George makes her mother really happy, and our main character really wishes that she could feel the same way. However, George is just so despicable. He clearly is fetishizing Ji-won's mother and herself and her sister as well. He's very creepy. He's very much got a lot of very racist beliefs. Even though he finds Asian women sexually attractive, he is very, very outwardly racist. He refuses to learn Ji-won's name or how to pronounce it. He gives her and her sister nicknames and even mixes them up a lot, and just the way that he talks to their mother is very condescending, and he's just the worst. This book, I think, could be equal parts triggering and cathartic because while the things that Ji-won experiences and just has to go through all of the microaggressions and the overt racism and fetishization, unfortunately that's something that I feel like a lot of Asian American or just Asian women in general can and unfortunately do experience and can relate to. However, you know, Ji-won does not want to take this lying down. George and his actions are really her last straw and really brings her to a snapping point. She starts fantasizing about eating eyes, and not eyes of animals, but eyes of humans. She starts fantasizing about how delicious they would taste, how delicious blue eyes would taste, in particular George's blue eyes. And as our main character descends into madness, she's going to try and take down the patriarchy and the system with her a little bit as well. So I am almost done with this. I have about 30 more pages, but I figured like it's getting very, very shocking, and I want to kind of film some of my reactions to the last little bit of this book because I just have a feeling this book is going to end in such a shocking way. George is absolutely the worst, and then some other people that our main character encounters as as well are the worst as well. So it is like a little bit cathartic at times, you know, just watching her go through these actions. I'm not condoning physical violence, but I definitely see how like good for her horror and just like female rage horror, female serial killer horror, why that is like so popular right now, because it can feel cathartic to read. And some of this, as I was reading it, I was like, this must have felt so cathartic for Monica Kim to write. So keep in mind there's a lot of racism in here, so it can be very triggering, but also I do think it deals with it in a way that it would feel a little bit cathartic as well. So I am just chomping at the bit to read this one. So I'm gonna go finish this one up and then I will let y'all know my final thoughts. So I'm really happy to say that I finished this book and I really loved it. The ending was just like I had anticipated, very explosive, a lot of revelations, a lot of crazy things happening, and I really enjoyed this one. I'll definitely be looking out for more by Monica Kim. This is a debut. This is an exceptionally strong debut. This was really good. I'm really glad to have read it. If you like good for her horror, or if you like weird girl horror, I think you would really like this. Add this to your TBR for spooky season because it was really good. One thing that I wanted to briefly touch upon in this review is that this book does utilize dream sequences. Now those can be so hit or miss for me, and honestly, normally I don't love a dream sequence in a book, but the way that this was written, and you understand it all by the end, but the way this is written where you have dreams at the very start of the book, you know clearly that they're dreams. Throughout the book, however, you start getting sequences, and it takes you and it takes our main character Ji-won longer and longer to realize that they're dreams, what's reality. I thought that was so expertly done and really added to the sense of our main character unraveling slowly throughout the book. She was such a complex character. This is a great example because I know I talked about this with how to make a horror movie and survive, that this is a good example of main characters and even side characters that are very flawed, very complex, especially with our main character. She's not like perfect. She is very flawed. Obviously, one of the biggest flaws you could say is that she has a desire to consume other people's eyeballs. Our main character makes some terrible decisions in here. She makes some bad decisions like throughout her life, not just following this eye-consuming journey. There are other things that you maybe read and you're like, okay, I would have handled this differently. Or she does things that feel not great, especially when it comes to her relationships with her mother and her sister. There are some times where you're like, what are you doing? What are you doing? And I think that Monica Kim did a great job of just really fleshing out, pun I guess intended, a character that has so many flaws but is so engaging to read from. I just really love this. Again, incredible debut. It doesn't feel like a debut at all. This feels like a seasoned author, and I'm so excited to see what Monica Kim comes out with next. This was very surreal body horror with social commentary, and I just loved it. So second book in this vlog went a whole lot better. We are now moving on to the third and final book in this vlog. And the last book of this vlog is going to be Bury Your Gaze by Chuck Tingle. I noticed on the dust jacket for this one, there's a blurb by CJ Lead, who I really enjoy as an author, and it says, "This triumph of a book effortlessly and cleverly upends every cliche, one of the best novels ever about LA and horror movies." So that's really intriguing. I've been hearing good things about this book. I'm going to go get to reading, and I will check back in later and let y'all know my thoughts. So I am now 20% of the way through Bury Your Gaze. I'm really enjoying this so far. We are following our main character, Misha, and he is a screenwriter. He is known for his queer horror movies and shows, and he's made a really big name for himself. He's currently working on a TV show that has 2 main gay leads. He's been building up to the season finale where all of the pining and the shipping and the fandom are going to finally get their payoff with these 2 characters finally confessing their love for each other, but he gets called in to his studio and the people in charge say that he has to either kill them off or make them straight. He does not like this option. Obviously, this is a very problematic trope, and he fights against it. He thinks that since it's his show, he should be able to tell the story the way he wants to tell the story. However, this studio that he's been working with has slowly become more and more dependent on AI. That's going to be a big theme in this that I did not know about, and I'm really excited to see the commentary on AI and like computer storytelling, pushing out artists from artistic fields. But the numbers say that the show will be more profitable if it's a straight show or if the gay characters are killed off. So Misha does not accept this. He's going to write the story that he wants to. Executives and algorithms be damned. However, once he makes this decision and he is writing his own screenplay and ignoring what the executives tell him to do, he starts seeing different characters from famous movie and TV shows, including characters he has made himself, start appearing in his life. And that is where I'm at so far. So I am really enjoying this one. At 20% of the way in, we've already been introduced to a number of characters that feel very distinct from each other. The narration style is working really well for me, so I don't have too much more to update other than I'm really optimistic about this one so far. I'm really intrigued. Like I mentioned before, I knew this was like Hollywood horror. I knew it had to deal with the Bury Your Gaze trope. However, I did not expect like AI to be such a big part of this, and the commentary of how turning all of art into essentially one big algorithm and having machines instead of actual artists do the work really kills an industry. So I'm really looking forward to this. I'm gonna keep reading it today, and I will check back in tomorrow and let y'all know some more of my thoughts. Okay friends, so I'm now 45% of the way through Bury Your Gaze by Chuck Tingle, and I am still so pleasantly surprised by this one. I know this one I was the most hesitant about going into during this vlog, just because I had tried Camp Damascus earlier on. I think I tried it last year and I didn't really love it, so I DNF'd it. But this one is a lot of fun. It's really blending horror and comedy in a really great way. I think it's such a rare book that can not only have but actually stick the landing and the delivery of both comedic elements and then horror elements, because there are lots of there's some funny moments in here. We also have a lot of social commentary satire, but we also have some moments, some scenes that are very chilling as well. I think that's a really hard balance to accomplish in your books, and this is doing it really well. I don't know, maybe I'll go back and reread Camp Damascus. That was one I picked up via audiobook, so maybe it's a situation where I would like the physical book more than the audiobook. But this one is pulling off that balance really well. I'm almost to the 50% point. I have a feeling that because there is I'm not gonna spoil too much of the story, but there is a little bit of a time restraint put on this story and the things that are happening. There's a time period for Misha that is a little bit paranormal. And so adding that time moment to a short book, it's actually referenced in here that they're talking about the time limit and they refer to it as the ring, which is just really delightful. I've really enjoyed all of the pop culture references in here, but I have a feeling because of that time restriction that we have on Misha to figure everything out and uncover these horrors, I think the second half of this book is going to absolutely speed by. So I cannot wait to dive into the second half. I'm gonna go read some more and I will check back in later with my thoughts. So I finished Bury Your Gaze and I really enjoyed it. Out of all of the 2024 releases, and there have been a lot that have come out this year that have to deal with Hollywood horror or the making of a horror movie, I think this one is going to have the broadest appeal. I didn't love it as much as I loved Horror Movie by Paul Tremblay. I think that is one of my favorite books that has to deal with a horror movie premise, but that one is very divisive, and I think that overall this one would appeal to a broader audience. So yeah, I had a lot of fun and I wasn't anticipating it. I think that potentially maybe either I might go back and try and read Camp Damascus again. Even if I don't do that, I will probably check out Chuck Tingle's next release because I was very pleasantly surprised by this one and I had a lot of fun. Not only did I have a lot of fun, this one really blended that satire and the comedic elements alongside the horror elements. Chuck Tingle also writes romance books and there is like a romance subplot in here. It's not necessarily like, it's not a falling in love romance. Our main character Micah has a boyfriend Zeke and just their interactions and the way that they deal with each other, very romantic. It's not by any means like a major plot in here, but just the character dynamics were written so wonderfully, so I can definitely tell that this author has written romance before, so that was nice. The characterization was great and this really balances, like it's kind of a campy premise, but Chuck Tingle knows how to do camp. It's a campy premise. We have a screenwriter whose characters are coming to life and trying to sabotage him, and that kind of sounds a little bit silly, so the book fully recognizes that and, you know, kind of balances the silliness versus the true horror of that really well. And then the commentary on AI in film and AI when it comes to the arts, really timely, really poignant. If you remember, like last year when the writer's strikes were happening and we were reading like what all that the corporations wanted to do and what the actors and the talent were fighting against, one of those things was that even if you were an extra, if you were to sign a contract, the companies wanted to own your likeness and your image for AI. And this dives into just how creepy and horrible and dystopian that concept would be in terms of being able to take someone's face and use it for AI, and just in general the entirety of the fear that I think a lot of creatives have, and it's a very valid fear to have, about algorithms and AI and profit driving art as opposed to artists being able to create art. And not only that, but it also goes a little bit into queer washing and how corporations don't really give a shit about queer people unless it's June. Then they'll change their logo to rainbow and sell some really overpriced merch, but even with that lip service, they still have a tendency to cancel queer shows and to really not care about queer people unless they're profitable. The bury your gaze trope is still alive and well in this modern day and age, as well as focusing on queer trauma and like stereotypes of queer characters as opposed to queer joy or more nuanced stories. And I thought all of that, this is a short book, this is less than 300 pages, but I think this book did that all really well. I also want to mention there is an ace main character in here and she is really awesome. I think she's good ace rep. I can't speak for that myself, but I was looking through some reviews and it looks like she is great ace rep, and that is mentioned in here as well. That ace and asexual representation, like you don't really see any of it even in things that claim to have like a lot of queer rep. It's really rare to find ace and asexual characters, so definitely wanted to point that out as well. So this was the final book for this vlog. Overall, I think this vlog was a big success. I have read a lot of really disappointing 2024 releases this year, but this vlog I managed to find 2 2024 releases that I really loved. Not only did I read one that was on my radar and I thought that I would love and it really exceeded my expectations for it, but I also picked up a book by an author that I hadn't really enjoyed before, and then found a very pleasant surprise in Bury Your Gaze. So I definitely would recommend these two books. I know spooky season's coming up, September, October, we're all planning our TBRs. I think that these two books would be wonderful additions to add to your spooky season TBRs. They're really great 2024 releases. But thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, definitely give it a thumbs up. Leave a comment down below. Let me know what's your favorite horror book that you've read in 2024. Bonus points if it's a 2024 release. Subscribe to my channel for all of the bookish, horror, and cozy gaming content. Stay safe, stay spooky, and I will see y'all in the next video. Bye!